A man in a $4,000 suit slammed his checkbook onto the greasy workbench and pointed a manicured finger at Caleb Anderson's chest. "Name your number, boy. Everybody's got one." Caleb set down his wrench, wiped his hands on a rag, and looked the billionaire dead in the eye. "Mine's not for sale." The whole boatyard went silent. 6 months earlier, these same men had laughed when a grieving heiress handed a broke single father a rotting yacht nobody wanted. Not one of them knew what was buried under those floorboards, and neither did Caleb. But what he'd find would turn $85 million into the smallest part of this story. Before we go on, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, so I can see how far Caleb's story has traveled. And if you believe a man's worth was never meant to be measured by his bank account, subscribe and stay with me to the very end. At 4:45 in the morning, before the sun even thought about rising over the harbor, Caleb Anderson was already awake, sitting on the edge of a bed that sagged in the middle, listening to his daughter breathe in the next room. He didn't move for a full minute. He just listened. 6 years old, and Amara still slept the way she had as a baby. One arm thrown over her head, the other clutching a stuffed rabbit that had lost an ear back before her mother passed. Caleb had sewn that ear back on twice. Both times it had come loose again. He figured some things just weren't meant to stay fixed, no matter how careful your hands were. He stood, and his knees popped like a couple of old rifle shots. "Getting old, Anderson," he muttered to nobody. 36 years old, and his body already talked back to him every morning. 12 years of hauling engine blocks and crawling into cramped bilges did that to a man. He rolled his shoulders, felt the familiar knot between his shoulder blades that never quite went away, and padded quietly into the kitchen. 2 slices of bread in the toaster, 1 egg in the pan for Amara. He'd tell her he already ate. He hadn't. There wasn't a second egg, and payday was still 3 days out, and the rent envelope on the counter was $40 shy of what Mr. Delgado wanted by Friday. Caleb stared at that envelope for a long moment. Then he did what he always did. He folded the worry up small, tucked it somewhere behind his ribs, and got on with the morning. "Daddy." He turned. Amara stood in the doorway, hair a wild cloud, one sock on one sock off rabbit dangling from her fist. "Hey, baby girl, you're up early." "I heard the toaster." She rubbed her eye. "Is it a work day?" "Every day's a work day, sweetheart. You know that." "Saturday's not." He smiled, and it reached his eyes for the first time that morning. "You got me there. Saturday's not." She climbed up onto the wobbly kitchen chair, and he slid the egg in front of her, and toast, and the last of the orange juice poured into her favorite cup, the one with the chip on the rim that he'd sanded down smooth so she wouldn't cut her lip. "Eat up. Miss Rosa's gonna be here in 20 minutes. "Can I come to the boats today?" "It's a school day." After school, Caleb crouched down so he was eye level with her. This was the part of the morning he lived for, and dreaded in equal measure, because she asked every day. And every day he had to tell her something that felt a little bit like a lie, even when it was true. "Tell you what," he said. "You bring me home a good report from Mrs. Hoffman, and this weekend you and me will go down to the water. I'll show you the boat I've been working on. Deal?" Her whole face lit up. "The big white one. Sold that one, but there's always another." "Deal," she said solemnly, and stuck out her small hand. He shook it. Her grip was serious. She'd learned that from him. There are men in this world who inherit their fortunes, and there are men who inherit nothing but the shirt on their back and a stubborn refusal to lie down. Caleb Anderson was the second kind. His own father had worked the shipyards until his lungs gave out, and his father before that had worked the docks. Anderson men worked. It was the one thing nobody could ever take from them, and the one thing nobody ever tried to. By 5:15, Miss Rosa from downstairs had shuffled in with her housecoat and her coffee and her endless kindness, and Caleb had kissed the top of Amara's head, and he was out the door with a lunch pail that held exactly 1 peanut butter sandwich and an apple that was starting to go soft. The harbor at dawn had a smell to it, salt and diesel and rope and cold morning air, and Caleb loved it the way some men love a church. It was the one place in the world where he knew exactly who he was and exactly what he was good for. Which was the problem. Because the men who owned that harbor had already decided what he was good for too, and it was a whole lot less than what he knew he could be. The Blackwood Marina stretched along a half-mile of prime waterfront, and every slip in it cost more per month than Caleb's apartment cost in a year. Yachts sat gleaming in the pale light 50 feet, 70 feet, 100 feet of white fiberglass and chrome and teak owned by men who visited them maybe twice a season and paid other men to keep them looking like they were loved. Caleb was one of those other men. He clocked in at the maintenance shed where Big Tom already had the coffee going and the day's work orders spread across the table. "Morning, Cal." "Tom, you look like death." "I look like a man who's up before God. They're a difference." Tom laughed a big rolling laugh that shook his belly. Tom was the closest thing Caleb had to a friend at Blackwood, one of the few men there who saw him as a man first and a color second. "You got the Merryweather's generator today, and Harrelson wants somebody to look at his bilge pump before the regatta." Caleb glanced at the second name and felt something tighten in his jaw. "Harrelson asked for me specifically." "Harrelson asked for the mechanic." Tom shrugged. "You're the mechanic." He's got a way of making that word sound like something else. He's got a way of making everything sound like something else. Tom lowered his voice. "Between you and me, man couldn't tell a bilge pump from a bathtub. Just do the work, take his money, go home." That was the whole philosophy of surviving a place like Blackwood, boiled down to one sentence. Do the work, take the money, go home. Caleb had lived by it for 12 years. Most days it held, some days it didn't. He was 3 hours into the Merryweather generator, elbow deep in a fuel filter, when he heard the voice behind him. A big voice, the kind that expected the whole dock to turn and pay attention. "There he is. Hey you." Caleb didn't turn around right away. He finished seating the filter. Then he stood, wiped his hands, and turned. Gerald Harrelson stood on the dock with 2 other men in pastel golf shirts, all 3 of them holding drinks at 10 o'clock in the morning. Harrelson was maybe 60, red-faced, with the soft heaviness of a man who'd never lifted anything heavier than a 9-iron. "You looked at my pump yet?" Harrelson demanded. "It's on my list, Mr. Harrelson. I'll be over this afternoon." "This afternoon." Harrelson looked at his friends and made a face, the kind of face that invited them to share in his disbelief. "You hear that, this afternoon? I got the regatta in 2 days. Pump'll be running by tonight. You have my word." "Your word." Harrelson took a sip of his drink. "You know what my time's worth? Any idea?" Caleb held his tongue. He was good at holding his tongue. 12 years of practice. "Tell you what," Harrelson went on, warming to his audience. "You come do my pump right now, I'll make it worth your while. What is it, you people?" He paused, and the pause hung there in the salt air, ugly. "What do you fellas charge cash? Under the table. Come on. You people." There it was. There it always was, sooner or later, one way or another. Sometimes it came dressed up in fancy words, and sometimes it came out plain like this, but it always came. Caleb felt the old heat rise up in his chest. He thought about Amara. He thought about the rent envelope $40 short. He thought about how many afternoons he'd swallowed exactly this so he could put food on a table. "The marina sets the rates, Mr. Harrelson," he said, and his voice was flat and even, which cost him more than shouting would have. "You want to move up your appointment, you talk to the front office. I'll have your pump running tonight." He turned back to the generator. Hey, I'm talking to you." Caleb kept working. One of Harrelson's friends said something low, and the 3 of them laughed, and Caleb heard the word attitude float across the water, and then they wandered off toward the clubhouse. Drinks in hand, the whole encounter already forgotten by them, the way a man forgets a fly, he waved off. Caleb stood there for a moment with his hands braced on the generator housing. Then he closed his eyes, breathed out slow, and got back to work. Do the work. Take this money. Go home. But that morning, for the first time in a long time, the philosophy tasted like ash. There was a bench at the far end of the marina, past the last slip, where the fancy boats gave way to the working docks, and the water got a little dirtier, and nobody rich ever bothered to walk. Caleb ate his lunch there most days, alone mostly, the way he liked it. That day, he wasn't alone. Old Sal was already on the bench when Caleb came around the corner. Sal Patrizio, 78 years old, who'd worked those docks longer than anybody could remember, and who the marina kept on out of what Caleb suspected was more guilt than gratitude. Sal's hands shook now. His back had a permanent bend to it. But he showed up every single day, and he coiled rope, and he swept, and he did what he could. "Caleb," Sal said, and shifted over to make room. "Sal." Caleb sat, unwrapped his sandwich, broke it in half without being asked, and handed one part over. This was a thing they did. Neither of them ever mentioned it. "You hear Harrelson giving you the business this morning? Half the harbor heard it. Man's a horse's ass." Sal took a bite, chewed thoughtfully. "Been coming here 15 years, and I never once seen him look a workin' man in the eye. You know what that tells you about a person?" "Tells me plenty." "Tells you everything." Sal pointed the sandwich at him. "My old man used to say you want to know a man, don't watch how he treats the boss. Watch how he treats the fella who can't do a thing for him." He nodded slowly. "You now. You always look me in the eye. Every day 12 years. Never once made me feel like I was in the way." Caleb didn't know what to say to that, so he said what he always said. "You'd do the same for me, Sal." "Maybe, maybe not. World's got a lot of men who wouldn't." Sal chewed. "Your girl. How old's she now?" 6. Just turned 6. 6. Sal shook his head, smiling. "You know what you're raising there? You're raising somebody who's gonna look people in the eye. That's worth more in every boat in this harbor, and don't you let nobody tell you different." They ate the rest of their lunch in the easy silence of two men who understood each other. And Caleb, who'd started the day feeling like the ground was crumbling under his feet, felt something steady itself in his chest. He didn't know it yet, but somebody was watching. So, across the harbor at that exact moment, a woman stood alone at the end of a long private pier and asked herself what in God's name she was supposed to do with any of it. Vivian Caldwell was 34 years old, and 11 days earlier she had buried her father, and now she owned more than she could count. Ships, warehouses, shipping contracts on 4 continents. A maritime empire that her father, Arthur Caldwell, had built from a single tugboat into one of the largest privately held companies in America. It was hers now. All of it. Every dollar and every headache and every hard-eyed board member who'd been quietly circling since the funeral, wondering how long the daughter would last before she ran the whole thing into the ground. She'd spent her whole life being Arthur Caldwell's daughter. A man the whole world admired. A man who could command a room, close a deal, charm a senator. A man who had never once in 34 years said the words, "I'm proud of you," to the only child he had. He'd been distant her entire life, present at the office, absent at home. He'd sent her to the finest schools and never come to a single recital. He'd given her everything money could buy and almost nothing it couldn't. And now he was gone, and she was left standing on a pier full of things she'd inherited, feeling like she'd inherited a stranger's life. "Ms. Caldwell?" She turned. It was Preston, her father's her chief operating officer. Preston Hale. 50, silver-haired, expensive, and about as warm as a bank vault. "The board's asking about the harbor assets," Preston said, walking up with a tablet in his hand, and that permanent look of mild impatience he wore like cologne. "There's a list of things we can liquidate immediately. Free up some capital, show the board you're being decisive. First quarter as CEO, you want to come out swinging." "What kind of assets?" "Slips, some old equipment, and this." Preston gestured down the pier toward the far end, where something enormous and dark sat half-hidden under a rotting tarp. "That's been costing us dock fees for years. Your father should have scrapped it a decade ago." Vivian walked toward it. Preston followed, still talking. "It's a yacht, old one, wood hull, which nobody wants anymore, maintenance nightmare, insurance nightmare. Frankly, it's a liability just sitting there. We've had 2 offers over the years, both scrap value. My recommendation is we take the scrap money and be done with it." Vivian pulled back a corner of the tarp. Underneath was a boat. 70 feet easy. Wooden hull gone gray with neglect. The paint peeling in long curls, the brass fittings green with corrosion. Water had gotten in somewhere. She could smell the rot, the old wet wood, the mildew. And yet, there was something about the lines of it, the way it sat in the water even now, even broken. The curve of the bow, the proportions. Somebody had built this thing by hand a long time ago, and they'd built it with love. "What's it called?" she asked. Preston checked his tablet. "The Celeste, registered to the company in 19 years ago. Your father bought it personally." He frowned. "That's odd. There's no acquisition rationale in the file. Just the purchase and then nothing. Never used, never chartered, never sold. He just kept paying to keep it here." Vivian went very still. Her father. Her cold, distant, profit-obsessed father, who had never in his life kept a thing that didn't earn its keep. Who'd sold his own boyhood home to a developer without a second thought. Who measured everything in dollars. That man had quietly paid dock fees on a rotting wooden yacht for 19 years and never told a soul why. "Ms. Caldwell," Preston prompted, "should I authorize the scrap sale?" "No." Preston blinked. "I'm sorry. I said no, not yet." She couldn't have explained it if he'd held a gun to her head. She only knew that her father had kept this thing, and her father never kept anything, and she wasn't about to sell off the one mystery he'd left her before she understood what it meant. "I want to look into it first." Preston sighed the sigh of a man watching his morning get more complicated. "With respect, it's a money pit. Every day it sits here." "I heard you, Preston. My answer's the same." She let the tarp fall back over the bow. "Give me a week." She'd have to hire someone to even assess it. Someone who understood old boats. Someone who could tell her whether the Celeste was a rotting liability or something her father had seen that nobody else had. And as she turned to walk back up the pier, deciding all of this, she happened to look across the water toward the working docks. And she saw a man giving half his sandwich to an old dockhand. She almost didn't register it. It was such a small thing. But something made her stop and watch. She watched the tall man in the coveralls break his lunch in two and hand half to the trembling old man beside him, easy as breathing, like it wasn't even a decision. She watched him talk to the old man, actually talk, leaning in, listening the way you listen to somebody who matters. She was too far to hear the words, but she could read the shape of it. Respect, warmth. Two men who had nothing sharing what little they had. "Who's that?" she asked Preston. "Down there. The mechanic." Preston barely glanced. "Which one?" "The one who just gave away half his lunch." Preston looked and shrugged. "No idea. One of the maintenance crew. They come and go." He said it the way you talk about the weather or the tide. Interchangeable, forgettable. "Why?" Vivian didn't answer. Because her father, for all his coldness, had said one thing to her once, exactly once, when she was maybe 12 years old, and he'd caught her being unkind to a household maid. He'd knelt down. She could still remember it. One of the few times he'd ever knelt to her level, and he'd said, "Vivian, you want to know what a person is really worth? Don't ever watch how they act when someone important's looking. Watch what they do when they think nobody is." Then he'd stood up and gone back to his study and closed the door, and he'd never said anything like it again, and she'd half forgotten it for 20 years. And now, standing on a pier next to a boat he'd secretly loved, she watched a man do a kind thing with no camera and no audience and no reward, and her father's voice came back to her so clearly it made her breath catch. "I'll be down at the office," Preston said. "You'll want to review the Henderson contracts before—" "Find out his name," Vivian said. "Who's—" "The mechanic's. The one down there." She was still watching. The old dockhand was laughing now at something the tall man had said. "I want to know his name." Preston looked at her like she'd started speaking in tongues. "Ms. Caldwell, we have a great deal to—" "His name, Preston." She turned and looked at her COO, and for the first time since her father died, she felt something almost like certainty settle into her spine. "Please." It rained that afternoon. Not a soft rain, either one of those hard, cold, sideways rains that come off the water with no warning and soak a man to the bone in 90 seconds. The rich men and their guests scattered off the docks and up into the clubhouse, where it was warm and dry, and the bar was open. Caleb didn't have that option. He had Harrelson's bilge pump to finish, and a promise to keep, and so he stayed out in it, hunched over the open engine. Well of a boat that wasn't his, in a downpour, doing the work he'd said he'd do. He was almost done when he heard the shout. Down the dock near the fuel station, old Sal was struggling. The dock cart, the heavy one loaded with mooring chain, had gotten away from him on the wet planks and pinned him against a piling, and Sal was down on one knee, trying to hold 200 pounds of steel off his leg, with hands that shook on a good day. Caleb didn't think. He was moving before he'd finished the thought. He hit the cart at a dead run, put his shoulder into it, and heaved it back off the old man. Chain spilled across the wet deck. Sal went down the rest of the way gasping. Sal, look at me. You hurt? My leg? Caleb ran his hands down Sal's shin, quick and sure, the way he'd learned in first aid years back. Can you move your foot? Wiggle it for me. Sal wiggled it, wincing. It's not broke. Might be a bad bruise. You're okay. You're okay, old man, I got you. Caleb got an arm under him. Up we go, nice and slow. The rain hammered down on both of them. Caleb got Sal to his feet, got him under the little overhang by the fuel station, out of the worst of it, and crouched there checking him over while the water ran off both their faces. Coulda broke my hip, Sal said, shaking. Coulda been the end of me, that thing come down on me wrong. But it didn't. You're all right. Caleb squeezed his shoulder. You scared me half to death, you know that, running a loaded cart in this weather. What were you thinking? Front office wanted the chain moved, told 'em I'd do it. Front office can wait 5 minutes for the rain to stop. You hear me? Next time it's raining and they want something heavy moved, you come find me. Every time. I don't care what I'm doing. You got your own work. You come find me, Sal. Caleb said it with a weight that ended the argument. That's not a favor. That's just how it's gonna be. Sal looked at him then, and his old eyes were wet with something that wasn't rain. You're a good man, Caleb Anderson, he said quietly. World don't deserve men like you. It surely don't. Caleb waved it off, embarrassed, and helped him up onto the bench under the overhang to catch his breath. What Caleb did not know, could not have known, was that from a covered walkway 40 yards up the dock, a woman had watched the whole thing. She'd come down looking for him. She'd been told his name an hour before Caleb Anderson, 12 years on the maintenance crew. No complaints on file, no commendations either. Just 12 years of quiet work, and she'd come down to the docks to get a look at him, to figure out why she couldn't stop thinking about a man breaking a sandwich in half. And she'd arrived just in time to see him drop everything and run into the rain for an old man who could do nothing for him. No audience, no reward. Just a man who saw somebody in trouble and moved. Watch what they do when they think nobody's looking. Vivian Caldwell stood in the rain in a coat that cost more than Caleb made in 2 months. And she watched a mechanic she'd never met carry an old man out of harm's way. And something in her chest that had been frozen since her father's funeral began very slowly to crack open. She did not go down to him. Not then. It didn't feel right to walk up in that moment, all money and importance, and turn a genuine thing into a transaction. Instead, she went home. And she sat up half the night in her father's study, surrounded by his books and his ledgers and his silence. And she thought about the boat that everyone told her to scrap, and the man that everyone told her was interchangeable, and the father who'd spent his whole life chasing dollars and had secretly kept one worthless thing for 19 years for reasons he'd taken to his grave. And somewhere in those small hours, an idea took hold of her. A strange one. An idea that Preston would call insane, that the board would call reckless, that half the harbor would laugh at. She was going to give the Celeste to Caleb Anderson, not sell it, not scrap it, give it. She didn't fully understand why. She only understood that her father had left her 2 mysteries, a boat and a memory, and that some instinct deeper than logic told her the 2 belonged together, and that the man who'd run into the rain was the one meant to unlock them. Caleb finished Harrelson's pump at 7 that night in the dark in the last of the rain. He tested it twice. It ran clean. He left a note in the cabin, pump repaired and tested. Running well. C. Anderson, because he was the kind of man who signed his work even when the man he did it for would never say thank you. Then he clocked out, and he rode the bus home soaked to the skin, and he climbed the stairs to his apartment where Miss Rosa had kept a plate warm, and Amara had refused to go to sleep until he got home. "Daddy, you're all wet. It rained on me a little, baby girl." "A little." She giggled. "You're a fish." He changed into dry clothes and sat on the edge of her bed and let her tell him about her whole day, every second of it. The spelling test, and the girl who ate paste, and the drawing she'd made of the two of them standing on a boat, and he listened to all of it, every word, the way you listen to somebody who matters. "Mrs. Hoffman said I got the best grade on the spelling test," Amara announced. "Did she now? So does that mean we go to the water this weekend? A deal's a deal. Saturday, you and me." She smiled satisfied and burrowed down under her blanket with her one-eared rabbit, and within 2 minutes, she was asleep. Caleb sat there a while longer watching her breathe the way he'd watched her that morning and every morning. He thought about the rent envelope still $40 short. He thought about Harrelson and you people and the laughter that floated across the water. He thought about Sal saying, "World don't deserve men like you," and how he didn't feel like a man the world was doing any favors for. He thought about his wife Denise, gone 4 years now, and how she used to tell him on the nights when the weight of it all got heavy. "Caleb, you keep your head up. God's not done writing your story. You just haven't got to the good part yet." 4 years he'd been waiting on the good part. Some nights he wasn't sure it was coming. He turned off Amara's light, checked the lock on the door out of habit, and went to bed, not knowing, not having the first idea, that 11 miles away, a woman was sitting in a dead man's study, staring at ownership papers for a 70-foot yacht, writing his name at the top of them. Caleb Anderson. He didn't know that the next morning was going to change everything. He didn't know that a boat everyone had written off was about to be handed to a man everyone had written off, and that the two of them together were going to become something nobody in that harbor could have imagined. He only knew what he knew every night, that he'd done his work, that his daughter was safe and fed and asleep, that he'd kept his word and looked people in the eye and given away half his lunch and run into the rain for an old man, that he was, whatever the world said, a good man. And in the end, that would turn out to be the only thing that mattered. The knock came at 7:15 on Saturday morning, and Caleb almost didn't answer it. He'd been up since 5, same as always, and he'd promised Amara the water that day, and he was standing at the stove making pancakes, the good kind from scratch because it was Saturday, and a deal was a deal when someone knocked on his apartment door. Firm, 3 raps. Not the landlord's knock, not Miss Rosa's. "Daddy, somebody's here." "I hear it, baby. Stay put." He turned off the burner and wiped his hands and opened the door on the chain. First, the way a man does when he lives in a building where good news rarely comes knocking. There was a man in the hallway in a suit that didn't belong in that building. 50-something, silver hair, a leather folio under his arm, and an expression that suggested he'd taken a wrong turn somewhere and was hoping to correct it quickly. "Caleb Anderson." "Who's asking?" "My name is Preston Hale. I represent Caldwell Maritime." He said the company name the way some men say their own, with weight expecting recognition. "I'm here on behalf of Ms. Vivian Caldwell. May I come in?" Caleb didn't move to unchain the door. "Caldwell Maritime owns the marina." "Caldwell Maritime owns a great many things, Mr. Anderson. If this is about a boat I worked on, you can take it up with the front office. I do my work right. Every time. It's not about a boat you worked on." Preston paused, and something crossed his face. Reluctance maybe, or distaste, like he was about to say a thing he personally disagreed with. "It's about a boat Ms. Caldwell would like to give you." Caleb stared at him through the 4-inch gap the chain allowed. "Say that again." "Perhaps," Preston said, "I could come in." "No, He let the man in because Amara was watching from the kitchen with pancake batter on her chin and her eyes big as saucers, and because, whatever this was, Caleb wanted to hear it sitting down. Preston looked around the small apartment the way a man looks around a place he intends to leave quickly. He declined the chair Caleb offered. He set the leather folio on the kitchen table next to the rent envelope that was still $40 short, and he opened it. "Mr. Anderson, are you familiar with a vessel called the Celeste?" "No." "It's a 70-foot wooden motor yacht, built in 1951. It's been moored at the far end of the Blackwood Pier for approximately 19 years under company ownership." Preston slid a photograph across the table. "This is it." Caleb picked up the photo. He knew that boat. Of course he knew it. Every man who'd worked those docks knew the ghost at the end of the pier, the rotting hulk under the tarp that nobody touched, that the rich men joked about, that the gulls used for a roost. "That thing," Caleb said slowly, "is a wreck. On that point, Mr. Anderson, you and I are in complete agreement." Preston produced a document, thick official-looking, tabbed with little colored flags where signatures went. "Nevertheless, Ms. Caldwell has instructed me to transfer full and clear ownership of the vessel to you. No cost, no lien, no conditions. It's yours if you want it." Caleb set the photograph down very carefully, the way you set down something you suspect might be a trick. "Why?" "I beg your pardon. Why would a billionaire give me a boat? A woman I never met. Why?" Preston's jaw worked for a moment, and Caleb got the distinct impression that the man had asked himself that exact question and hadn't liked any of the answers. "Ms. Caldwell doesn't explain herself to me, Mr. Anderson. She saw you, apparently, on the docks, some days ago." Preston said it flatly. "She formed an impression, and she decided she wanted you to have the boat. That's the entirety of what I can tell you because it's the entirety of what I know." "She saw me." "So she says." Caleb sat back. Amara had crept closer, and he put an arm around her without thinking, drawing her against his side. "Daddy," she whispered, "did that man say we get a boat?" "Hush a second, baby." He looked at the document on the table. He looked at the tabbed signature lines. He looked at Preston Hale, in his expensive suit, standing in a kitchen that smelled like pancakes, holding out a thing that made no sense. Every instinct in Caleb's body told him to be careful. Men in nice suits didn't hand things to men like him. Not for free. There was always a hook in the bait. He'd learned that the hard way more than once. "What's the catch?" he said. "There's no catch." "There's always a catch." Preston sighed. "Mr. Anderson, I will be candid with you because I think candor serves us both. That vessel is, in my professional opinion, worthless. Worse than worthless, it's a liability. The maintenance alone will cost you money you don't have. If you accept it, you're accepting a problem, not a gift. As Ms. Caldwell's advisor, I counseled against this, strongly. So no, there's no catch. There's just a very rich woman making a very sentimental decision, and me doing my job by delivering the paperwork." He tapped the signature line. "You can say no. Honestly, if it were me, I would." And that strangely was the thing that made Caleb pick up the pen. Because a man with a hook in his bait talks it up, sells it hard, tells you it's the chance of a lifetime. This one was telling him to walk away, and Caleb had spent his whole life being told to walk away from things being told he'd probably never get another chance being told what a man like him should and shouldn't reach for. "You said no conditions," Caleb said. "None whatsoever. So it's mine, to do with what I want. Once you sign, it's as much yours as this apartment is." Caleb looked down at his daughter. Amara looked back up at him, and she didn't understand a bit of what was happening, but she trusted him completely, the way she trusted him about everything, and something in that trust settled the matter. "A boat," Caleb said softly, almost to himself. "Your daddy owns a boat." "A big one," Amara breathed. "A big one, baby. A real big one." He picked up the pen. Broken, but big. He signed his name on every tabbed line. Caleb Anderson. Caleb Anderson. Caleb Anderson. 12 times in his careful, deliberate hand, the same hand he used to sign his repairs. Preston gathered the pages, checked each signature, and slid one copy back across the table. "Congratulations, Mr. Anderson," he said, and Caleb couldn't tell if the man meant it or was mocking him. "You own a yacht!" At the door, Preston paused. He looked back at the small apartment, at the man and the little girl, and the pancakes going cold on the stove, and something in his hard face flickered. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've worked for the Caldwells 11 years. Arthur Caldwell never gave anything away in his life. Not one dime, not one favor without getting two back. His daughters, different. I haven't decided yet whether that's going to be a strength or a weakness." He settled his folio under his arm. "I suppose we'll find out. Good day, Mr. Anderson." And then he was gone, and Caleb was standing in his kitchen holding a piece of paper that said he owned a 70-foot yacht, feeling like the floor had tilted under his feet. "Daddy," Amara tugged his sleeve. "Can we go see it? Can we go see our boat? Please, please, please." Caleb looked down at her, and for the first time all morning, he laughed a real laugh from somewhere deep, half disbelief and half something that felt dangerously close to hope. "Yeah, baby girl," he said, "let's go see our boat." Word travels fast in a harbor. By the time Caleb walked down the Blackwood dock that afternoon, Amara's hand in his, half the marina already knew. Somebody in the front office had seen the transfer paperwork. Somebody had told somebody. And now up and down the docks, the rich men and the crews and the dockhands all found reasons to be standing near the far pier, watching when Caleb Anderson came to look at what he owned. He felt their eyes before he heard their voices. There he is! That was one of Harrelson's golf shirt friends standing by a 50-footer with a drink in his hand even now. Hey Anderson, that true? You own the ghost ship now." Caleb kept walking. "Afternoon. I heard the Caldwell girl gave you that pile of firewood." The man laughed, and a couple of others laughed with him. "Man, that is the funniest thing I heard all year. What are you gonna do, sail that thing's been taking on water for a decade? Bet he's gonna fix it." Another voice called out, dripping mockery. "Aren't you chief gonna fix it right up?" Caleb felt Amara's hand tighten in his. She was 6, but she wasn't stupid. She knew when grown men were being unkind to her father. He'd felt her do this before, go still and small when the world turned mean around him, and it broke something in him every single time. He crouched down right there on the dock in front of all of them, and he spoke to her low and calm. "You hear those men laughing, baby?" She nodded, her eyes wet. "Some folks laugh 'cause they think it makes them big. It doesn't. It makes them small. You understand, a man who's got to tear somebody down, he's already lost something." He tucked a curl behind her ear. "We're not gonna laugh at anybody, and we're not gonna cry in front of anybody. We're gonna go look at our boat. That's all. Can you do that with me?" Amara wiped her nose and nodded and stood up straight, chin lifted, 6 years old and trying to look like her daddy. "That's my girl. Come on." They walked the rest of the pier together, back straight past the laughter, past the drinks, past the men who'd already decided how this story ended. And Caleb didn't give them the satisfaction of a single backward glance. But he heard one more thing before they got out of earshot. Gerald Harrelson himself, who'd wandered down to see the spectacle, saying to the man beside him, in a voice pitched to carry, "People like him, they don't know what to do with things like that. Give a man a Rolls Royce, he still doesn't know how to drive." Caleb's step didn't falter, but that one lodged in him. That one he carried. People like him. The Celeste was worse up close than she'd looked in the photograph. Caleb pulled back the tarp, and the smell hit him: first rot, and mildew, and standing water, and 19 years of neglect. The deck was soft in places. The brightwork was gone gray and cracked. When he climbed aboard, careful testing each step, the whole boat groaned under him like a thing in pain. "Stay on the dock a minute, baby. Let Daddy make sure it's safe." "Is it broken?" "Real broken, sweetheart." He ran his hand along the cabin bulkhead, and paint flaked off under his palm. "Real broken." He should have felt discouraged. Any sensible man would have. He'd signed for a wreck, and the whole harbor had laughed at him, and he had $40 less than his rent, and now he owned a 70-foot money pit that couldn't even float without pumps. But Caleb Anderson had spent 12 years learning something the rich men on that dock would never understand. You can't judge a boat by its surface. He'd pulled apart engines that looked like scrap and found good iron underneath. He'd stripped hulls that looked hopeless and found sound wood beneath the rot. The surface was just the story the world told about a thing. What was underneath was the truth. So he didn't look at the Celeste the way the men on the dock looked at her. He looked closer. He crouched down and pressed his thumbnail into the wood of the cabin sole in a spot where the finish had worn away. Under the gray under-the-water damage, the wood was dark and dense and hard as iron. "Huh," he said. He'd expected pine. Cheap softwood, the kind you'd use on a production boat. This wasn't pine. He didn't know what it was, but it wasn't anything cheap, and it wasn't anything he'd seen on the fiberglass yachts up the dock. This was old growth, rare, the kind of timber you couldn't buy anymore at any price. He moved deeper into the cabin, and the deeper he went, the more the little wrongnesses started adding up in his mechanic's mind. The joinery, the way the panels came together, no screws, no nails, no glue that he could see. Hand-cut joints fitted so tight that even after 19 years of swelling and shrinking, they hadn't sprung. He'd seen furniture made like this in a museum once. He'd never seen a whole boat made like it. The fittings. He wiped 19 years of green off a cleat and found bronze underneath, not brass bronze, the good stuff cast and hand-finished. There were maker's marks stamped into it that he didn't recognize. And up in what must have been the pilot house, half buried under a collapsed shelf and a drift of rotted paper, he found the instruments. He knelt down and cleared the debris away, with his hands gentle, the way you'd uncover something fragile. And what he found stopped his breath. A ship's compass in a bronze binnacle. The glass cracked, but the card intact. A brass sextant in a fitted wooden case. The velvet lining rotted, but the instrument itself untouched. A chronometer, a barometer, a whole navigator's station, the tools of a real deep-water sailor. The kind of gear that hadn't been standard equipment since before Caleb's grandfather was born. These weren't the toys of a rich man's pleasure boat. Nobody put working deep-water instruments on a yacht that never left the harbor. This boat had been built to go somewhere, somewhere far, somewhere that mattered. "Daddy," Amara called from the dock. "You've been in there a really long time." "Coming, baby, coming." But he didn't come. He crouched there over the old navigator's station, and a strange feeling crawled up the back of his neck. The feeling a man gets when he realizes the thing everybody laughed at is not at all what everybody thought it was. Give a man a Rolls-Royce he still doesn't know how to drive. Maybe. But Caleb Anderson knew a Rolls-Royce when he was standing in one. And he was standing in one now under all that rot and all that laughter. He was standing in something that had been built by a master for a purpose a long time ago. He just didn't know yet what the purpose had been. He came back the next morning at first light before his shift with his own tools. He came back the morning after that. He came back every morning that week an hour before he had to clock in, and every evening after he clocked out, and all day both days of the weekend, with Amara playing on the dock beside him. He couldn't have explained the pull of it if you'd asked him. He only knew that the Celeste had gotten into his blood the way certain problems did the ones that kept a man up at night, the ones he couldn't put down until he'd solved them. Tom found him at it one evening still under the deck at 8 o'clock with a work light. "Cal, you're gonna kill yourself. You already worked 10 hours today." "I know it. For a boat that don't run, that you can't sell, that the whole harbor's laughing about." "I know that too." Caleb didn't look up from the frame he was examining. "Tom, come here a second. Look at this." Tom climbed down, grumbling, and crouched beside him. "What am I looking at? This frame, this rib right here. What's it made of?" Tom squinted. "I don't know. Oak?" "It's not oak. I checked. I don't even know what it is." Caleb ran his hand along the curve of it. "But look how it's cut. One piece. Grown to shape near about, they picked a tree that grew with this curve in it and cut the frame to follow the grain. Nobody does that. Nobody's done that in 70 years. You know why? 'Cause it's insane. 'Cause it's expensive. And slow. And it takes a master. Caleb sat back on his heels. Tom, this boat wasn't built to be a rich man's toy. Somebody built this boat to cross oceans, and they spared no expense doing it. Every inch of her is the best of the best. Tom looked at the frame, then at Caleb, then around at the rotting cabin. So what? Even if she was something once, she's junk now. You could sink a fortune into this and never get it back. Maybe. Caleb wiped his hands. But I keep asking myself a question and I can't shake it. What question? Arthur Caldwell. Caleb said the name slowly. Man who owned this whole marina. Billionaire. Sharpest businessman in 3 states, everybody says. Never kept a thing that didn't earn its keep. His own advisor told me that said Caldwell never gave away a dime without getting 2 back. Caleb looked at Tom. So you tell me, why did that man, that exact man, pay dock fees on this rotting wreck for 19 years and never sell it, never use it, never tell a soul why? Tom didn't have an answer for that. Rich men don't keep junk out of sentiment, Tom. Not that kind of rich man. He kept this boat because he knew something about it, something he never told anybody. Caleb turned back to the frame, his jaw set. And I aim to find out what. He found the first piece of it 3 days later. He was working the cabin's sole, the floor, pulling up rotted boards to get at the bilge beneath, and when he lifted the 4th board near the base of what had been a built-in berth, it didn't come up like the others. It resisted. And when he looked closer, he saw why. It wasn't a floorboard at all. It was a lid. Somebody had built a compartment into the sole of that boat, a hidden one fitted so cleverly that in 70 years, nobody had found it disguised as just another plank in the floor. And whoever built it had built it to last, because when Caleb finally worked it free, the compartment beneath was dry, sealed tight. 19 years of water sitting in that boat, and not a drop had gotten into that hidden space. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, was a bundle. Caleb's hands were shaking, and he told himself it was the cold. He lifted the bundle out. It was heavier than it looked, and carried it up into the fading daylight of the pilot house, and set it down, and very carefully began to unwrap it. The oilcloth came away in stiff folds. Inside were books. Leather-bound. The leather cracked, but the pages intact, protected all those years by the oilcloth and the sealed compartment. Journals. 6 of them, each one filled edge to edge with a tight slanting hand. The ink faded to brown, but still readable. There were photographs. Old ones. Real photographs, on heavy paper, showing men in old-fashioned clothes standing on the deck of a ship. Showing coastlines. Showing places Caleb didn't recognize. There were charts folded and refolded, hand-annotated in the same slanting hand with soundings and bearings and little notes in the margins. And there was one more thing. Wrapped separately in a scrap of what might once have been fine cloth. Caleb unwound it slowly. It was a navigational instrument, an old one, beautiful brass gone dark with age. Some kind of specialized sextant or octant finer than anything else on the boat, clearly precious. And engraved along its arc in flowing script, worn but still legible, was a name. Caleb read it. Then he read it again. And the back of his neck went cold. Captain William Harrington. He didn't know the name. Not then. He was a mechanic, not a historian. But something about the way it was engraved, the care of it, the pride of it, told him it mattered. Told him this instrument had belonged to somebody who was somebody once a long time ago. He knelt there in the pilot house of a boat the whole world had written off, holding a dead man's instrument, surrounded by a dead man's journals, and Caleb Anderson understood all at once, and with total certainty, that he had stumbled onto something far bigger than a broken yacht. "Daddy," Amara's voice, small from the dock. "Are you okay? You've been so quiet." Caleb wrapped the instrument back in its cloth, careful as if it were made of glass. "Yeah, baby," he called down, and his voice came out strange even to his own ears. "Daddy's okay. Daddy just found something. Daddy just found something real important." He didn't tell anybody at first. Not because he wanted to keep it secret. Caleb wasn't built that way, but because he didn't yet understand what he had. And he'd learned a long time ago that a man like him, holding something valuable he couldn't explain, was a man asking for trouble. So he took the bundle home. He wrapped the journals in fresh cloth and laid them on his kitchen table under the bad overhead light. And after Amara was asleep, he sat down and he read. He read all night. The journals belonged to a man named William Harrington, Captain William Harrington, and they were the records of a life spent at sea. Voyages, expeditions, long passages to places with names Caleb had to sound out. The captain wrote plainly the way a working man writes, no fancy words, just what happened and when and what it cost. And the further Caleb read, the more his heart pounded, because it became clear that this Captain Harrington had not been an ordinary sailor. He'd been an explorer, a real one. He'd charted coastlines that weren't on any map. He'd recorded currents and depths and observations that read even to Caleb's untrained eye like something that mattered. And there were references over and over to a final voyage, a big one, the one he'd been building toward his whole life, and to a vessel he'd had built special for it. A vessel he wrote about with a tenderness he showed nothing else. He never named her in the early journals, but in the last one, in an entry that made Caleb's breath catch, he wrote about her by name. He wrote about the Celeste. Caleb sat back in his kitchen chair at 3 a.m, the journals spread around him, and he pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. The boat everyone laughed at. The boat they called firewood. The boat they said a man like him wouldn't know what to do with. It wasn't just any old yacht. It was the personal vessel of a lost explorer carrying his private journals, his charts, his instruments. Things that maritime historians would give their right arms to see, things that might have been considered lost forever. And Arthur Caldwell had known. That was the piece that stunned Caleb most of all. Caldwell had bought this boat 19 years ago and hidden it away and told no one, and now Caleb understood why. The old billionaire hadn't kept a worthless wreck out of sentiment. He'd kept a secret. He'd known exactly what the Celeste was, and for reasons Caleb couldn't yet fathom, he'd chosen to protect it rather than profit from it. "What were you doing, old man?" Caleb murmured to the empty kitchen, to the ghost of a billionaire he'd never met. "What was this to you?" He didn't have an answer, not yet. But he knew one thing. He knew he was holding history in his 2 hands, the same 2 hands the harbor said were only good for fixing other men's engines, and he knew that whatever came next, nothing was ever going to be the same again. He went to Vivian Caldwell first. It was the right thing to do, and Caleb was a man who did the right thing even when it cost him. So 2 days later he put on his one good shirt, and he took the bundle carefully wrapped, and he went to the Caldwell Maritime offices, and he asked to see her. They almost didn't let him past the lobby. "Do you have an appointment?" the woman at the desk asked, looking at his good shirt. That wasn't good enough, at his working man's hands, at the wrapped bundle under his arm. "No, ma'am. But if you tell Ms. Caldwell that Caleb Anderson is here, the man she gave the boat to, I think she'll want to see me." The woman's expression shifted just slightly. She made a call. She spoke low. And a few minutes later, Preston Hale himself came down, frowning, and looked at Caleb with those hard, assessing eyes. "Mr. Anderson, this is unexpected. Is there a problem with the vessel?" "No problem." Caleb held the bundle a little tighter. "I need to see Ms. Caldwell. It's about the boat. It's important." "Anything concerning the boat you can bring to me?" "No, sir." Caleb said it quietly, but there was steel in it. "I can't. This one's for her. And I think when she hears it, she's not going to thank you for keeping me in the lobby." Something in his tone got through. Preston studied him a moment longer, then turned on his heel. "Wait here." He was back in 5 minutes, and his frown had deepened into something Caleb couldn't read. "She'll see you," Preston said, and he sounded almost bewildered by it. "Come with me." Vivian Caldwell's office was on the top floor, all glass and light, and a view of the whole harbor. And she stood, when Caleb came in, actually stood and came around the desk to meet him, which Preston clearly hadn't expected either. "Mr. Anderson." She put out her hand. "I'm glad to finally meet you." Caleb shook it. Her grip was firmer than he'd expected. "Ms. Caldwell, thank you for seeing me. I know I don't have an appointment. You gave the boat back." She said it lightly, but he caught the flicker of disappointment underneath, quickly masked. "Preston said it was about the Celeste. If it's too much of a burden, I understand. I'm not giving it back." Caleb set the bundle down on the low table by the window. "I came because I found something. On the boat. And you're the only person I trust to see it before I figure out what to do." Vivian went still. "Found something. Ms. Caldwell." Caleb met her eyes. "I need to ask you a question, and I need you to tell me the truth. Your father. Did he ever say anything to you about that boat, about why he kept it?" "No, never. I didn't even know he owned it until 11 days after he died." Something crossed her face. "Why, Mr. Anderson? What did you find?" Caleb looked at her, really looked at her, and he saw past the wealth and the fine office and the famous name to the thing underneath, which was a woman who'd lost her father before she'd ever really known him, and who was standing there hoping, without daring to hope, that a stranger with a wrapped bundle might be about to hand her a piece of him back. He'd seen that look before. He'd worn it himself 4 years ago, standing at a graveside. "Your father didn't keep a worthless boat, Ms. Caldwell," Caleb said gently. He began carefully to unwrap the cloth. "He kept a secret, and I think it's about time somebody found out what it was." He lifted out the first journal and set it in her hands. And Vivian Caldwell, billionaire heiress, who had inherited ships and warehouses and an empire and a father-shaped hole in her heart, opened the cracked leather cover of a dead explorer's journal and began slowly to understand that the man everyone in that harbor had written off had just handed her the most valuable thing she owned. She read for a long time without speaking. Caleb stood by the window and let her. He understood that kind of silence, the kind a person needs when they're holding something bigger than words. Vivian turned the pages slowly, her fingers barely touching the old paper, and twice he saw her stop and press her lips together and blink hard before she went on. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet. "This handwriting," she said. "This is real. This is 100 years old. Closer to 70, I figure, but yes, ma'am, it's real." "Who was he, this Harrington?" "I don't know for certain. I'm a mechanic, not a professor, but I read every one of those journals cover to cover, and I'll tell you what I believe." Caleb came and sat across from her. "I believe he was an explorer, a real one, the kind they don't make anymore. He charted places nobody had charted. He wrote down things, currents, coastline soundings that read to me like they mattered. And that boat down at the end of your pier." He nodded at the journal in her hands. "He had it built special, for one last voyage, the big one, the one he'd spent his whole life getting ready for. And my father knew this. That's the part I can't figure." Caleb leaned forward. "Ms. Caldwell, everybody I talk to tells me the same thing about your father. Sharpest businessman anybody ever met, never kept a thing that didn't turn a profit. Your own Mr. Hale told me straight out, Arthur Caldwell never gave a dime without getting 2 back." Vivian let out a small, broken laugh. "That's him. That's exactly him. So you tell me, why does a man like that buy a rotting boat, hide it at the end of a pier, pay to keep it there 19 years, and never once try to make a dollar off it, when it's sitting on top of something historians would fight over?" Caleb shook his head. "That's not a businessman, Ms. Caldwell. That's something else. A man doesn't protect a thing like that unless it means something to him, something personal." Vivian was quiet a moment. Then she stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the harbor at the far end of the pier where the tarp-covered ghost of the Celeste sat waiting. "My father was 2 people," she said finally, her back to Caleb. "There was the man the world knew, the one on the magazine covers, ruthless, brilliant, cold." She wrapped her arms around herself. "And then there was the man I lived with, who was cold to me too mostly, who never came to a single thing I did, who I don't think ever once told me he loved me." She turned around. "But every now and then, Mr. Anderson, there'd be a crack, a moment. He'd say something or do something that didn't fit the man everybody thought he was. And I'd catch a glimpse of somebody else underneath. Somebody who wanted— Her voice caught. Somebody who wanted something money couldn't buy and never let himself have it. Caleb nodded slowly. The boat sounds like one of those cracks. It does, doesn't it? She looked at the journals spread on the table like they were something holy. He kept a secret his whole life, and he never told me, and now I'm standing here trying to understand my own father from a dead explorer's diaries. She laughed again, that same broken sound. You know what's strange, Mr. Anderson? You've been in his head more than I ever was. You spent 3 nights reading these. I got 34 years and I understood him less. Ma'am, if I could. Caleb hesitated. That's not a fair thing to lay on yourself. A child understands a parent by what the parent shows them. If he didn't show you, that's not your failing. That's his. Vivian looked at him for a long moment, and something shifted in her face. Surprised maybe that a stranger she'd handed a boat to out of a whim had just said the truest thing anyone had said to her since the funeral. You're a kind man, Caleb Anderson, she said quietly. I don't think you know how rare that is where I come from. I know how rare it is where I come from too, Caleb said, which is why I try to be it. They agreed before he left that this couldn't stay between the two of them. Whatever the Celeste was, whatever those journals held, it was too important to sit in a wrapped bundle on a low table. It needed people who understood these things. Historians, experts, people who could tell them whether they were holding what Caleb thought they were holding. I know someone, Vivian said. The Maritime Heritage Institute. My father donated to them for years, one of his cracks, I suppose. Their director's a man named Dr. Ellison. If anyone can tell us what this is, it's him. Then we call him. There's one thing, Mr. Anderson. Vivian's expression turned careful. The moment I make that call, this stops being a private matter. Once experts get involved, once they confirm what this is, if it's what you believe, word gets out. It always does. And when it does— She trailed off. When it does, what? When it does, that boat stops being a joke the harbor laughs at and starts being something a lot of very powerful people are going to want. She held his eyes. And you're the man whose name is on the ownership papers. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Right now, you own a punchline. But if Dr. Ellison confirms this by next week, you'll own something worth a fortune, and people will come for it. Some of them won't be nice about it. Caleb was quiet a moment, taking that in. Ms. Caldwell, he said, can I tell you something? 3 days ago, the richest man on that dock told his buddies loud enough for my little girl to hear that people like me don't know what to do with things like that boat. His jaw tightened. So no, ma'am. The idea of powerful people not being nice to me doesn't scare me the way you think it might. I've been dealing with powerful people not being nice to me my whole life. This is just the first time I had something they wanted. Vivian looked at him, and slowly she smiled. Make the call, Caleb said. She made the call. Dr. Nathaniel Ellison arrived at the Blackwood Pier 4 days later with 2 graduate students, a case full of instruments, and the skeptical expression of a man who'd spent 30 years having his time wasted by people who thought their grandfather's rowboat belonged in a museum. That expression lasted about 90 seconds. Caleb watched it happen. He watched Ellison climb aboard the Celeste with a polite professional detachment, watched him run a hand along the hand-cut frame Caleb had shown. Tom watched him stop, watched him crouch, watched him take out a little glass and lean close to the joinery and go very, very still. This isn't possible, Ellison said quietly. What isn't? Vivian asked. Ellison didn't answer right away. He moved deeper into the boat faster now, all his detachment gone. He examined the bronze fittings. He examined the timber. He got up into the pilot house and knelt over the navigator's station Caleb had uncovered, and when he saw the instruments still in place, Caleb heard him make a sound like a man who'd been punched. Where are the documents? Ellison said, standing up abruptly. You said on the phone there were documents, journals. Where are they? Safe, Caleb said. Off the boat. I wasn't going to leave them sitting in a wreck to rot. Ellison turned and looked at Caleb for the first time, really looked at him like he was recalibrating something. "You're the mechanic, the owner." "Caleb Anderson." "Yes, sir." "And you took the documents off the vessel, stored them properly, kept them dry." Ellison's voice was strange. "Do you have any idea?" He stopped himself. "Show me, please, right now. Show me the journals." They spread everything out in a conference room at the Institute the next day: the journals, the charts, the photographs, the engraved instrument, and Dr. Ellison and 3 of his colleagues went over it all for 6 straight hours while Caleb and Vivian waited. When Ellison finally came out to them, his hands were shaking. "I need to sit down," he said, and did. He looked at Caleb, then at Vivian, then back at the wrapped instrument on the table, like he couldn't quite believe it was real. "Do you know who Captain William Harrington was?" "No, sir," Caleb said. "I was hoping you'd tell me." Ellison let out a long breath. William Harrington was one of the most important maritime explorers of the last century, and one of the great mysteries of it. He leaned forward. Late in his career, he undertook a series of expeditions charting surveying oceanographic work decades ahead of its time. His findings were considered extraordinary. And then Mr. Anderson, he vanished. Him, his vessel, his records, all of it. Gone. For 70 years, historians have believed his final journals were lost forever. His last expedition, the culmination of his life's work, was a blank page in the record. Ellison's voice dropped. A blank page. Until 3 days ago, when a mechanic pulled up a floorboard. The room was silent. "You're telling me," Vivian said slowly, "that these are—" "I'm telling you that what's sitting on that table is the missing record of one of history's lost expeditions. I'm telling you that this vessel is almost certainly Harrington's own, Celeste thought destroyed for 7 decades. I'm telling you." Ellison had to stop and collect himself. "In 30 years in this field, I have never seen anything like this. This isn't a find, Mr. Anderson. This is a resurrection. This rewrites chapters of maritime history that we'd given up as lost." Caleb sat very still. "How much?" Vivian said quietly. "Dr. Ellison, what is this worth?" Ellison laughed a little wildly. "Worth to scholarship, it's priceless. To collectors." He shook his head. "Ms. Caldwell, Mr. Anderson, you're going to get offers. Serious ones. Museums, universities, private collectors. And I'll be honest with you, because you deserve honesty once this becomes public, and it will. You are going to be at the center of something you cannot imagine. That instrument alone." He nodded at the engraved octant. Harrington's personal instrument. The one thing every account of him mentions, the one thing that could authenticate the entire find, that alone would draw bids most people never see in a lifetime. Caleb looked at the octant, at the name engraved along its arc, Captain William Harrington. "Sir," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "That boat's been sitting at the end of that pier for 19 years, in plain sight. Anybody could have climbed aboard and pulled up that floorboard, same as me. Why didn't they?" Ellison spread his hands. "Because no one looked, Mr. Anderson. Everyone who walked past that vessel saw a wreck. They saw exactly what they expected to see: garbage, a liability, a thing to be scrapped. And so they never looked closer." He met Caleb's eyes. It took someone who was willing to look at a thing everyone else had written off and see something worth saving. That's not a small thing. That's frankly the rarest thing in the world. Caleb didn't say anything, but beside him, Vivian did. "Yes," she said softly, watching Caleb's face. "It is." It got out just like Vivian said it would. Somebody at the Institute talked, or somebody saw the paperwork, or the world simply worked the way the world works. But within a week, the story of the lost Harrington expedition and the mechanic who'd found it was everywhere. And the harbor that had laughed at Caleb Anderson stopped laughing all at once. The first offer came by phone to the Institute, forwarded to Vivian's office. $10 million for the vessel and its contents sight largely unseen from a private collector who didn't give his name. 10 million, Vivian told Caleb and watched his face carefully. That's the opening, Mr. Anderson. Caleb, do you understand? That's $10 million. For a boat you were given for free 2 weeks ago. Caleb sat in the chair across from her desk, and he didn't say anything for a long moment. Caleb, I keep thinking about the rent, he said finally. What? When Mr. Hale came to my door with the papers, there was an envelope on my kitchen table. Rent money. $40 short of what I owed. And I signed for a boat everybody laughed at, and I remember thinking, Lord, what am I doing? I can't even make rent, and now I own a hole in the water. He laughed a low, disbelieving sound. And now a man I never met is offering $10 million for it over the telephone. 25, Vivian said. The next one was 25. It came in this morning. Caleb went quiet again. Talk to me, Vivian said gently. What's going through your head? You want to know the truth? Caleb looked up. The truth is, I'm scared. Of the money. Of what money does. To people. To things. He gestured at the wall at the harbor beyond it. I've spent 12 years watching rich men, Ms. Caldwell. Watching what they do to each other over money. Watching what they do to a place, to the people who work for them when a dollar's on the line. And now I'm holding something they all want, and I keep thinking... He stopped. Thinking what? That the second I take one of those checks, it stops being about Captain Harrington. It stops being about his journals and his last voyage, and whatever it was your father saw in that boat. It becomes about the money. Just the money. And whoever writes the biggest check makes it disappear into some vault somewhere, and nobody ever sees it again. Caleb shook his head slowly. That boat was hidden for 70 years. Your father hid it for 19 more. And I keep asking myself, what were they protecting it from? And I think the answer is from exactly this. From it becoming just another thing rich men buy and lock away. Vivian sat back in her chair and looked at him, and there was something like wonder in her expression. Do you have any idea, she said slowly, how many people I know who would have taken the 10 million before Preston finished saying the number? And you're sitting here $40 short on rent 2 weeks ago, worried about what happens to a dead man's legacy. Somebody's got to worry about it, Caleb said simply. Nobody worried about it for 70 years. Look how that turned out. The offers didn't stop. They accelerated. 50 million came from a European collector. A museum consortium put together 60. Every day, Vivian's phone rang with a new number, a new voice, and every day, Caleb turned them over in his mind and turned them down. And the harbor which had laughed now came to him hat in hand. That was the part Caleb found hardest to stomach, because the same men who'd mocked him now wanted to be his friend. Gerald Harrelson himself caught Caleb on the dock one morning, all smiles, extending a hand like they'd been buddies for years. Caleb! There he is, the man of the hour. Harrelson pumped his hand. Listen, I always knew there was something special about you. Told the fellas. Said that Anderson, he's got a good head on him. Say we should have lunch. I know some people. Investment people. A man in your position, you're going to want the right advisors. Caleb took his hand back. Mr. Harrelson, he said. 3 weeks ago, you told your friends right in front of my 6-year-old daughter that people like me don't know what to do with things like that boat. He kept his voice level. You remember that? Harrelson's smile flickered. Now, Caleb, that was just, you know how it is, just talk guys talking. It was in front of my little girl. I didn't look if she heard something she took the wrong way. She took it exactly the way you meant it. Caleb held his eyes. I'm not telling you this to get an apology. I don't want one. I'm telling you so you know that I heard you, and so you know that when you shake my hand now and call me the man of the hour, I remember what you called me when you thought I was nothing. He stepped back. Have a good day, Mr. Harrelson. And he walked away and left Gerald Harrelson standing on the dock with his hand still half out. And for once in his life, the rich man had nothing to say. Sal saw the whole thing. He was coiling rope nearby, moving slow the way he did now. And when Caleb came past, the old man was grinning ear to ear. You see his face? Sal wheezed with delight. You see it. 12 years I watched that man look through workin' folks like we was glass and you just... He slapped his knee. Lord have mercy, Caleb. That was worth more'n all the money they're waving at you. Maybe. Caleb slowed to walk beside the old man. How's the leg, Sal? Leg's fine. Bruise healed up. Sal peered at him. You okay, son, all this? It's a lot for a man. It's a lot, Caleb admitted. You know what they're all saying, don't you, Hole Harbor? They're saying you're gonna be rich, saying you'll take one of them big checks, and we'll never see you down here again. Sal's grin faded a little. That true? Caleb stopped walking. You think I'd do that? Sal, just take the money and disappear. I think a lot of men would. Sal shrugged. I think most men would. Wouldn't blame 'em neither. Man gets handed a fortune, he'd be a fool not to take it. Would he? Caleb looked out at the water. Sal, let me ask you something. That instrument I found, Captain Harrington's. You know what the professor told me? He told me that in every account of that man's life, they mentioned that one instrument. It was the thing he carried everywhere. The thing that meant the most to him. And for 70 years, everybody thought it was lost at the bottom of the ocean. He shook his head. That man gave his whole life to going places nobody'd been and writing down what he found so other people could follow. He didn't do it to get rich. He did it so it wouldn't be lost. Caleb turned to Sal. And now I'm supposed to sell it to the highest bidder so he can lock it in a vault where nobody sees it ever again. So it's lost all over again, just in a nicer box. Sal was quiet. No, Caleb said. I don't think I can do that. I don't think that's what any of this was for. Vivian found him on the dock that evening, sitting on the bench at the far end, where he ate his lunch, watching the sun go down over the water. She'd changed out of her office clothes, and without them, she looked younger and tired and more like a person. Preston's beside himself, she said, sitting down beside him. There's a new offer. I wanted to tell you in person. How much? $85 million. She said it quietly. $85 million, Caleb. For the vessel, the journals, the charts, the instrument, everything. A private buyer. Preston says it's the highest he's ever seen for a maritime artifact. He says we'll never see a number like it again. Caleb didn't answer right away. He watched the sun touch the water. You know what the worst part is, he said finally. The worst part is that it's a real number, 10 million. I could tell myself it wasn't real. It was somebody being crazy. But 85, that's a serious offer from a serious person. That's Amara never wanting for anything the rest of her life. That's a house with a yard. That's the scholarship money for every kid whose daddy fixes boats and can't send them to school. That's real Vivian. That's a good I could do with it. He turned to her. So don't think I'm turning it down because I don't understand what it is. I understand exactly what it is. That's what makes it so hard. You're going to turn it down, Vivian said. It wasn't a question. Not the money. I'd be a fool to turn down the money, and Sal's right, I've got a little girl to think about. Caleb rubbed his face. But I can't just take the biggest check and walk away and let some rich man lock Captain Harrington in a vault. I can't. If I sell it, whoever buys it, there have got to be conditions. The journals stay together. The public gets to see it. It goes somewhere real, a museum someplace where a kid like Amara could walk in off the street and see what one man did with his life. He looked at her. That's not going to be worth $85 million to a private collector who wants it for himself. I know that. I'm probably leaving a fortune on the table. Vivian was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Caleb, she said, can I tell you something about my father? Course. When I was going through his records trying to understand why he kept the boat, I found something. A file. It wasn't about the boat's value. There was no appraisal, no plan to sell, nothing like that. Her voice was unsteady. It was research. Files on Harrington. My father spent years quietly learning everything he could about that expedition. Not to profit from it, just to know it, to protect it. She looked out at the water. My father, the man who never gave a dime without getting two back, spent 19 years, and God knows how much money protecting a dead explorer's legacy, and told no one and got nothing for it, and I never knew, and now he's gone, and I can't ask him why. Caleb was quiet. And then I handed the whole thing to a stranger, Vivian went on, because I saw him give away half a sandwich. And that stranger read my father's secret in a dead man's journals, and then sat on this bench and told me he'd rather leave a fortune on the table than let Harrington be locked in a vault. Her voice broke. You understand what you're doing to me right now, Caleb Anderson. You're the only person alive who wants the same thing my father wanted. And I never even got to want it with him. She was crying now quietly, and Caleb did the only thing he knew how to do, which was the same thing he'd done for Sal in the rain and for Amara 100 times. He didn't say anything clever. He just put a steady hand on her shoulder and let her. He'd have been proud of you, Caleb said finally, for not scrapping it, for giving it a chance. That's the same thing he did Vivian. You didn't understand your father while he was alive, but you just did the exact thing he'd have done. That's understanding him. That's about the deepest kind there is. Vivian wiped her eyes and let out a shaky laugh. Look at us. Billionaire's daughter and a marina mechanic crying on a bench about a dead sailor. Stranger things, Caleb said, and she laughed for real this time. They sat there a while as the light went. So what do we do? Vivian asked. 85 million from a man who'll lock it away, or something less done right. Caleb thought about Amara asleep at home with her one-eared rabbit. He thought about the rent envelope $40 short. He thought about Captain Harrington giving his whole life so that what he found wouldn't be lost. He thought about Arthur Caldwell quietly protecting a secret for 19 years and dying before he could tell his own daughter why. He thought about looking people in the eye. We do it right, Caleb said. Whatever that costs, we find a way to do it right. And in the dark beside him, Vivian Caldwell reached over and took the hand of the man everyone had underestimated and held it, and did not let go. Preston Hale did not take the news well. Caleb was in Vivian's office the next morning when she told him, and he watched the color climb up the man's neck as the words landed. Turn it down. Preston said it flatly like he'd misheard. You want me to turn down $85 million. I want you to go back to the buyer with conditions, Vivian said calmly. Conditions. Preston set down his tablet with exaggerated care the way a man does when he's holding on to his temper by a thread. Ms. Caldwell, with all respect, this is the highest offer for a maritime artifact in the history of the field. Mr. Anderson. He turned. You were given this vessel 3 weeks ago, for nothing. You had $40 to your name. I stood in your kitchen, and now you're going to look me in the eye and tell me you want to add conditions to $85 million. Yes, sir, Caleb said. That's about the size of it. Why? Preston's voice cracked on the word. Give me one reason that makes sense. Because the man who bought it wants to lock it away, Caleb said. Your own words, Mr. Hale. You told Miss Caldwell it was a private buyer who wanted it for himself. That means those journals go into a vault and nobody ever reads them again. And I'm not going to be the man who found Captain Harrington just to bury him a second time. Preston stared at him. You're serious? I'm serious. You're going to leave. Preston stopped, pressed his fingers to his forehead. Do you know what people would do for that money? Do you have any concept? I've got a real good concept, Mr. Hale. Caleb's voice stayed level, but something underneath it didn't. I've been poor my whole life. I know exactly what $85 million is. I know it down to the penny in a way you never will because you never had to. So don't tell me I don't understand what I'm turning down. I understand it better than anybody in this building. The office went silent. Preston looked at him a long moment, and something in his hard face shifted. Not agreement, not yet, but the first grudging recognition that he wasn't dealing with a fool. The buyer will walk, Preston said, finally quieter. You understand that. You attach conditions like that, he walks, and there's no guarantee anyone matches that number. You could be trading $85 million for nothing. Then he walks, Caleb said, and we find somebody who'll do it right. Preston turned to Vivian. And you're backing this? I'm backing this, Preston. Your father, Preston started. My father, Vivian said, and there was steel in it now, spent 19 years protecting that boat and never told a soul. Don't you dare invoke my father to talk me into selling it to a man who'll hide it in a vault. My father would rather have burned it than that. She held his eyes. Go back to the buyer. Conditions. The journals stay together, the collection stays whole, and the public gets access. Take it or leave it. Preston looked between the two of them, the heiress and the mechanic united against him, and Caleb watched him understand that he'd lost. I'll make the call, Preston said, but when this falls apart, I want it on the record that I advised against it. So noted, Vivian said. Make the call. The buyer walked, just like Preston said. 2 days later, the word came back. The collector wasn't interested in conditions. He wanted the artifact clean and private, his and his alone, or nothing. And when Vivian's people held firm, he withdrew the offer entirely. $85 million gone in a single phone call. Preston delivered the news with the grim satisfaction of a man whose prophecy had come true. It's done. He's out. And I'll tell you what happens now. Mr. Anderson, word gets around fast in these circles. Every other buyer just learned that you turned down $85 million over conditions. Some of them will respect it. Most of them will decide you're difficult or naive or both, and they'll lowball you or walk away. You may have just cost yourself everything. Caleb took it standing up. Maybe, he said. Maybe, Preston repeated incredulous. That's all you've got. Maybe. Mr. Hale, I've been broke my whole life. I was broke 3 weeks ago. If this all falls apart, and I'm broke again, then I'm right back where I started, and I know how to live there. Caleb's voice was quiet and sure. But I'll be broke knowing I did right by that man's memory, and I can live with that a whole lot easier than I could live with $85 million and a guilty conscience. Preston opened his mouth, closed it, and for the first time since Caleb had met him, the man had absolutely nothing to say. That night, Caleb went home and sat at his kitchen table, the same table where he'd signed the papers, where the rent envelope had been $40 short, and he told Amara the whole thing in words she could understand. So we're not going to be rich, she asked, working through it. Might not be, baby, might not be. But you found the treasure. I found the treasure, and I'm going to make sure everybody gets to see it. That's more important than being rich. Amara considered this with the enormous seriousness of a 6-year-old. Is it more important than a backyard? Caleb laughed, and it hurt a little. We'll see about the backyard, sweetheart. We'll see. She climbed into his lap and put her head against his chest, and he held her, and he thought not for the first time that he'd made a decision that any sensible man would call insane, and he'd do it again 100 times over. Daddy. Yeah, baby. Those men who laughed at you. At our boat. She looked up at him. Are they laughing now? No, sweetheart, Caleb said softly. They're not laughing now. It was Dr. Ellison who found the way through. He called the institute together. Vivian, Caleb, his own colleagues, and he laid it out plainly. You've been thinking about this as a sale, he said. One buyer, one check, one owner. But that's not the only way this can go. There's another kind of buyer entirely. Foundations, endowed institutions, bodies whose entire purpose is to preserve and display exactly this sort of thing and to make it public. He looked at Caleb. The conditions you're asking for aren't a burden to them, Mr. Anderson. They're the whole point. You've been trying to sell a public treasure to private men. Sell it to the public instead. They can't match $85 million, Preston said. He'd come to the meeting despite himself unable to stay away. Foundations don't have that kind of liquidity for a single acquisition. No, Ellison agreed. They can't match 85. But a consortium, several institutions together, plus a public heritage grant, plus donors who care about this legacy, could put together a very serious number. Not 85, but serious. And every one of Mr. Anderson's conditions would be met, because they're the conditions those institutions would insist on themselves. He turned back to Caleb. The journals stay together. The collection stays whole. And it goes on public display so that a child can walk in off the street and see what William Harrington did with his life. Exactly what you asked for. Caleb looked at Vivian. How much would a consortium like that come to? She asked Ellison. With the Heritage Grant and the right donors. Ellison did the math in his head. I'd estimate somewhere in the range of 40 to 50 million. For a public acquisition of this significance, it would be nearly unprecedented. 50 million. Half of what the private buyer had offered. Caleb heard Preston exhale sharply, and he knew what the man was thinking, that Caleb had just cost himself $40 million for a principal. That's a lot less than 85, Caleb said slowly. It's a lot less than 85. Ellison agreed. I won't pretend otherwise. If money is what matters most to you, this isn't the answer. Caleb was quiet a long moment. Dr. Ellison, he said, can I ask you something one more time? When you first climbed on that boat, before you knew what it was, why'd you go so still? Ellison blinked at the change of subject. Because I recognized the craftsmanship. I understood in that moment that I was standing in something that shouldn't exist, something everyone believed was gone. And if it had been sold to that private buyer, locked in his vault, what happens to it then? Then it's gone again, Ellison said quietly. For all practical purposes, a thing that no one can see, that no one can study, that no scholar can reference, and no child can visit it, might as well be at the bottom of the ocean. It exists, but it's lost. Lost, Caleb repeated. He nodded slowly. That's the word. That's the whole thing right there. He looked around the table at Ellison, at Vivian, even at Preston. Captain Harrington spent his life making sure his work wouldn't be lost, wrote it all down, kept it safe, died out there somewhere making sure. And your father, he looked at Vivian, spent 19 years keeping it from being lost and never got a thing for it. 2 men generations apart, both giving up something so this wouldn't disappear. He set his hands flat on the table. I'm not gonna be the man who takes the biggest check and undoes all of it. We do the consortium. We do it right. 50 million or 5, we do it right. There was a silence in the room. And then Preston Hale. Preston of all people said something nobody expected. There may be a way, Preston said slowly, to make the number larger. Everyone looked at him. Caldwell Maritime. Preston went on, and he seemed almost surprised to be saying it. The foundation arm. Arthur Caldwell established a charitable foundation years ago, one of his eccentricities. It's endowed, substantially. And its mandate... He stopped, looked at Vivian. Its mandate, which your father wrote himself, is the preservation of maritime heritage. I always assumed it was a tax vehicle. I never understood why he cared. Something moved behind his eyes. I think I understand now. Vivian stared at him. You're saying my father's own foundation. I'm saying, Preston said, that if the Caldwell Foundation were to anchor this consortium, the number changes considerably. And I'm saying, he paused, that I believe it's precisely what Arthur Caldwell established that foundation to do. I just never had the piece that made it make sense. He looked at Caleb, and his voice was different now, stripped of its earlier contempt. You found the piece, Mr. Anderson. In a floorboard. It took months to put together. Caleb kept working the whole time. That surprised people, that a man sitting on a fortune in waiting still showed up at 4:45 every morning to fix other men's engines. But Caleb didn't know another way to be. And the truth was, the work steadied him. While the lawyers argued, and the foundations negotiated, and the number moved up and down. Caleb Anderson kept his hands busy, and his head down, and his word good, same as he always had. The harbor watched him do it, and the harbor changed its mind about him slow but sure. Sal put it best one afternoon on the bench. You know what the difference is between you and every other man who ever came into money down here, the old man said. They stopped showing up. Minute they didn't have to work, they were gone. You're still here. He shook his head. 12 years I watched men treat you like you didn't belong. And now you belong more than any of them. 'Cause you're the only one who stayed. Where would I go, Sal? That's exactly my point, son. That's exactly it. Vivian came around often, too. What had started as a business arrangement between them had turned into something Caleb didn't have a good word for. Not romance, it wasn't that, or wasn't only that, though he'd caught himself noticing the way she laughed and caught her noticing things about him, too. It was more that the two of them had found in each other the one other person who understood what all of this was really about. Who understood that it had never been about the money. Preston asked me something strange yesterday. She told Caleb one evening, the two of them sitting on the tailgate of his old truck at the edge of the marina lot, watching Amara chase gulls down the dock. What did he ask? He asked if I was disappointed that we're getting 50 and change instead of 85. She swung her feet. And I told him no. And he didn't understand it, so I tried to explain, and I realized I couldn't. Not to him. There aren't words for it that make sense to a man like Preston. Try 'em on me. Vivian was quiet a moment. My whole life I had everything. And I was miserable, Caleb. Genuinely. I had a father who never saw me, and a fortune I didn't earn, and a life that looked perfect, and felt empty. She looked out at Amara, laughing on the dock. And then you handed me a dead explorer's journal and asked me to do the right thing with it. And for the first time in my life, I was part of something that mattered. Something that wasn't about me or my father or money. Something good. She turned to him. I'd rather have that than the extra 35 million. I'd rather have it 100 times over. And I never knew that about myself until you showed me. Caleb didn't say anything for a moment. You know what your father did? He said finally. When he kept that boat, he was trying to find that same thing. That's what I think anyway. All that money, and somewhere in him he knew it wasn't enough, and he grabbed onto one true thing and held it in secret because he didn't know how to hold it out loud. Caleb looked at her. He never figured out how to give it away, Vivian. That was his tragedy. He protected the treasure, but he did it alone in the dark, and he died with it still a secret. Caleb nodded toward Amara. You're doing it out loud, in the light, with people. That's the part he couldn't do. That's the part you got that he never did. Vivian's eyes filled, and she looked away out at the water. I miss him, she said quietly, which is strange because I never really had him. But I miss the father I could have had, the one who protected that boat. If I'd known that man. You do know him, Caleb said. You're becoming him, the best part of him, the part he kept hidden. He nudged her shoulder gently. Only you're doing it better. You're letting people in. Down the dock, Amara shrieked with laughter as the gulls scattered up into the evening sky, and Vivian Caldwell wiped her eyes and laughed too. And for a moment, the three of them, the mechanic, the heiress, and the little girl, looked to anyone watching exactly like a family. The deal closed on a gray morning in early spring. The Caldwell Foundation, anchoring a consortium of the Maritime Heritage Institute, 2 universities, and a public heritage endowment, acquired the vessel Celeste and the complete Harrington archive for a sum that, when it was finally announced, made headlines across the country. It was not $85 million. It was $52,300,000, the largest public acquisition of a maritime artifact in the nation's history. But that wasn't the number that mattered to Caleb. The number that mattered to Caleb was written into the agreement in the conditions he'd insisted on from the start, and refused to bend on through months of negotiation. The archive would stay together, every journal, every chart, every photograph kept as one collection, never to be broken up or sold off piece by piece. The Celeste would be restored painstakingly to exactly what she'd been when Captain Harrington sailed her. And all of it, the boat, the journals, the instruments, the whole resurrected story of a lost expedition, would go on permanent public display free of charge so that anyone at all could walk in off the street and see it. Anyone. A scholar, a tourist, a single father and his little girl. Caleb signed the final agreement in the same careful hand he'd used to sign the ownership papers 3 weeks after he'd never expected to own anything at all. Caleb Anderson. And when the pen came up off the paper, Dr. Ellison shook his hand, and Vivian squeezed his arm, and even Preston Hale. Preston extended his hand and said quietly, You were right, Mr. Anderson. I'll admit it. You were right, and I was wrong, and I've been doing this 30 years. Caleb shook his hand and told him there was no shame in it, that any man could be wrong, that the measure of a man was whether he'd say so. And Preston looked at him a long moment and said that he was beginning to understand why Vivian trusted him. His share of the acquisition after the foundation's anchor and the grants and the endowment funds came to more money than Caleb Anderson had ever imagined touching in a dozen lifetimes. Not 85 million, but life-changing, generation-changing. The kind of money that meant Amara would never lie awake wondering if her daddy could make the rent. He drove home that day, and he sat in his truck outside the apartment building for a long while before he went up, just breathing, just letting it be real. He thought about the man he'd been 3 weeks ago. The one with $40 less than the rent, the one they laughed at on the dock, the one Gerald Harrelson said didn't know what to do with things like that boat, people like him. He'd shown them what a man like him did with a thing like that. He'd done right by it. Every step of the way, when it would have been easier and richer to do wrong, he'd done right. And it had cost him $33 million. And it had been worth every penny he'd never see, because when he closed his eyes, he could see Captain Harrington's journals safe and whole under museum glass, and a line of ordinary people filing past to look. And somewhere in that line, someday, a kid who fixed boats and never thought he'd amount to anything, seeing what one determined man could do with a life. Caleb wiped his face, and he was surprised to find it wet. Then he went upstairs to tell his daughter that they were going to be all right, that they were going to be more than all right, that her daddy, the man everyone had overlooked, had been trusted with something precious and hadn't let it be lost. They were going to be all right. Caleb told Amara that night, sitting on the edge of her bed, the way he did every night, and she didn't fully understand what it meant. 6-year-olds don't understand fortunes, but she understood the look on her daddy's face, which was a look she'd never seen before, and it made her put down her one-eared rabbit and wrap both arms around his neck. "Are you happy, Daddy?" Caleb had to think about the answer because he wanted to give her a true one. "Yeah, baby," he said finally. "I'm happy. I did something I'm proud of. That's the best kind of happy there is. Better than the backyard kind." He laughed. "We're gonna get the backyard too, sweetheart. Turns out we get both kinds." She fell asleep before he finished the story he was telling her the way she always did, and Caleb sat there in the dark a while longer, listening to her breathe the same as he'd listened every morning of her life. Only this time, the worry that usually sat behind his ribs wasn't there. For the first time in 4 years, maybe longer, Caleb Anderson sat in the quiet and felt no fear about tomorrow. He'd expected the money to feel like a wall coming down, like everything changing all at once. But it didn't. It felt quieter than that. It felt like a man who'd been holding his breath for a very long time, finally being allowed to let it out. Bug. The house he bought wasn't grand. That surprised people too. The man who'd turned a free boat into a piece of history and a life-changing fortune could have bought anything, anywhere. And instead, Caleb Anderson bought a modest 3-bedroom on a quiet street 20 minutes from the water, with good bones and a fenced yard, and an old oak tree that Amara declared the moment she saw it was the best tree in the entire world. "This one, Daddy. This one right here. You don't want to see the others." "No, this one has the tree." She was already running for it. "Can I climb it? Can we get a swing? Can Miss Rosa come live near us?" Caleb watched his daughter tear across a yard that was hers, now, hers to play in, hers to grow up in, and he had to lean against the porch rail a moment because his knees felt strange. He'd never owned anything in his life. Now he owned this, and it wasn't the size of it or the price of it that got him. It was the yard. It was the backyard he'd promised a little girl he wasn't sure he could give her, made real with a tree in it and everything. Vivian came by the day they moved in. She brought a housewarming gift, not something expensive, which she'd learned by then that Caleb wouldn't have wanted, but a framed photograph. It was one of the old photographs from Harrington's archive, a reproduction the captain himself standing on the deck of the Celeste, squinting into a sun that had set 70 years ago. "I thought," Vivian said, a little uncertain, that you might want him watching over the place, given everything. Caleb took the frame and looked at the long-dead face of the man whose journals had changed his life, and something moved in his chest. "He's the whole reason for all of it," Caleb said quietly. "Him and your father. Two men I never met." He looked up. "It's a good gift, Vivian. It's the right gift. Thank you." He hung it in the front hall where you'd see it every time you came in the door. Captain William Harrington keeping watch over a single father's house. And every visitor who ever asked about it got the whole story start to finish, because Caleb never once told it in a way that made himself the hero. He always told it as the story of a man who wouldn't let his life's work be lost, and a rich man who protected it in secret, and a mechanic who was just lucky enough to pull up the right floorboard. But the people who heard him tell it always came away understanding something Caleb never said out loud, that the luck wasn't in the finding. Anybody could have found it. The luck was that when it was found by a man who did the right thing with it. He didn't stop working. He'd told Vivian he wouldn't, and he meant it, but the shape of the work changed. The idea came to him slowly over the months of the restoration, watching the old craftsmen the Institute brought in to bring the Celeste back to life. They were master shipwrights, most of them well past retirement age, men who knew how to work wood the way Harrington's builders had worked it by hand, by eye, by feel, and Caleb realized watching them that when they were gone, most of what they knew would be gone with them. Nobody was learning it. The young people went into fiberglass, into factories, into anything but the slow-dying craft of building a thing by hand. "It's a shame," one of the old shipwrights told him, running a plane along a length of new planking for the Celeste's deck. 50 years I've done this, and when I go, that's it. Nobody's coming up behind me. The whole trade dies with my generation." "What if somebody came up behind you?" Caleb said. The old man laughed. "Who's gonna pay a kid to spend 7 years learning to do slow what a machine does fast?" Caleb thought about that for a long time. Then he went and did something about it. He used a piece of his money, a real piece, not a token, to start a foundation of his own. A restoration workshop and a school, both down at the water, where the old masters could teach the young the things that were disappearing. He funded scholarships deliberately for kids from families like the one he'd grown up in. Kids whose fathers fixed engines and couldn't send them anywhere. Kids the world had already decided didn't have much of a future. He named it the Harrington Trust. "Not the Anderson Trust," Vivian asked him when he told her. "You did all this. It should have your name on it." "It's not about my name." Caleb shook his head. Harrington gave his life so what he knew wouldn't be lost. That's the whole idea. That's what the school's for, so what these old men know doesn't get lost either. It's the same thing. It's all the same thing, Vivian. Passing on something worth keeping so it doesn't disappear. He smiled. "Man's name should be on it, not mine." Vivian looked at him a long moment. "You know," she said, "there are men who'd have put their name on a building and called it charity. And here you are naming your own foundation after a stranger who's been dead 70 years. "He's not a stranger to me anymore," Caleb said simply. "I read his whole life. I know him better than I know most living men." He shrugged. "Besides, my name'll be on it where it counts, on the kids who come out of it. That's the only place a man's name ought to be anyway, on the people he helped up." The first class of the Harrington Trust had 11 students in it. Caleb was there the first morning at 4:45 Old Habits to unlock the doors and put the coffee on before any of them arrived. They came in nervous. Most of them young and unsure kids who'd been told their whole lives that they weren't the kind who got chances like this. Caleb knew that look. He'd worn it his whole life. He gathered them around before the old shipwright started the day's teaching, and he didn't give them a speech because Caleb Anderson had never been a speech kind of man. He just told them the truth. "Some of you got told you don't belong here," he said. "That people like you don't get to learn things like this, do things like this, be trusted with things like this." He looked around at their faces one at a time. "I got told the same thing, my whole life, and I'm going to tell you what I learned, and then we're gonna get to work and I'm not gonna say it again." He paused. "The people who tell you what you can't be, they're wrong. They were wrong about me. They're wrong about you. The only thing that ever mattered was whether I showed up and did the work right every day, whether anybody was watching or not. That's the whole secret. That's all of it. You do that, and one day the same people who laughed at you are going to be standing in line to shake your hand." He picked up a plane off the bench. "Now, who wants to learn how to make a thing that lasts 100 years? 11 hands went up. Caleb Anderson smiled, and he handed the first kid the plane, and he taught him how to hold it. The Celeste took 2 years to restore. When she was finished, when the last plank was laid, and the last fitting polished, and the old bronze gleamed the way it had the day Harrington sailed her, they held an opening at the Maritime Museum where she was to be displayed. It was a real event. There were dignitaries. There were scholars who'd flown in from 3 countries to see the resurrected vessel of a lost expedition with their own eyes. There was press. And there, in the middle of all of it, stood a marina mechanic in the one good suit he now owned, with his daughter's hand in his. Amara was 8 now, and she'd grown into a serious, watchful girl who looked people in the eye exactly the way Sal had predicted she would. She stood beside her father in her good dress, taking it all in: the crowd, the lights, the great restored boat on its cradle at the center of the hall, and she tugged Caleb's sleeve. "Daddy, is that our boat?" "It was our boat, baby, for a little while. Now it belongs to everybody." "Because you gave it to them." "Because I made sure everybody could see it, yeah." He crouched down beside her. "You remember when the men laughed at it at us?" She nodded. She remembered. She'd been small, but she remembered. Look at it now. Caleb turned her gently toward the great gleaming vessel and the crowd of important people gathered around it in awe. "That's the thing they laughed at. And here's all these folks who flew across the whole world just to look at it." He kept his voice low just for her. "Don't you ever let anybody tell you what a thing is worth just by looking at the outside of it, sweetheart. Or a person, you hear me? Not a boat and not a person. You look closer. You always look closer. Promise me." "I promise, Daddy." And Caleb Anderson believed her because she was his daughter and because he'd raised her above everything else to look closer. Vivian found him near the end of the evening, standing off to the side, watching the crowd move around the boat he'd saved. "You did this," she said, coming to stand beside him. "We did this." "No." She shook her head. "I gave a man a boat because I saw him share a sandwich. That's all I did, Caleb. Everything after that was you. Every hard choice, every offer you turned down, every condition you wouldn't bend on. This," she gestured at the hall, at the restored Celeste, at the scholars and the crowds. "This is you. This is what you did with a thing everyone else had thrown away." She looked at him. "Including, I think, yourself. You didn't just restore a boat, Caleb. You restored something in yourself, too. The part the world spent 36 years telling you wasn't worth anything." Caleb didn't say anything for a moment. He watched the crowd. "You know what the strangest part is?" he said finally. "I'm the same man. That's the thing I keep coming back to. I'm the exact same man I was 3 years ago, $40 short on the rent, getting laughed at on the dock. I didn't change, not one bit." He turned to her. "The only thing that changed is that now people can see what was there the whole time. That's all. The worth was always there. It just took a boat nobody wanted for anybody to look." Vivian was quiet. "My father would have liked you," she said softly. "No, that's not right." She corrected herself. "My father would have wanted to be you. That's closer to the truth. He spent his whole life chasing what you had for free." "What's that?" "A clear conscience," Vivian said. "The knowledge that you did right by the things that mattered even when it cost you. He never had that, Caleb. All that money, and he never once had that. And you had it broke, and you kept it rich. That's the whole thing. That's what he was looking for at the end of that pier and never found." She wiped her eyes, laughing at herself for crying again. "He hid a treasure because he didn't know how to be the kind of man who could give it away. And you gave it away without a second thought. You were the man he wanted to be. You just didn't have the money yet. Across the hall, Amara had wandered up to the great boat and was staring up at it, and old Sal, who Caleb had insisted be brought to the opening in a wheelchair now, but grinning ear to ear, was beside her telling her something, pointing up at the vessel. And Preston Hale, of all people, stood nearby with a glass in his hand, and when he caught Caleb's eye across the room, he raised the glass just slightly, in a quiet salute from one man to another. Caleb raised his back. "You know what I think about sometimes," Caleb said. "Your father paying those dock fees for 19 years. In secret. All alone. Protecting a thing he couldn't tell anybody he loved." He shook his head slowly. "That's the saddest thing I ever heard, Vivian. A man doing a good thing in the dark because he was too afraid to do it in the light. Nobody to share it with. Nobody to be proud of him for it." He looked at her. "You didn't get that from him. Whatever else you missed, you didn't get that. You do your good things in the light. With people. That's the thing he couldn't teach you because he never learned it himself. You learned it anyway." Vivian looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something she'd never quite done before. She leaned over and kissed him on the cheek, quick and simple, and said, "Thank you, for seeing him, for seeing what he was underneath. Nobody else ever did, not even me, until you." The years went on, the way years do. The Celeste stayed where Caleb had put her in the museum on public display, free to anyone who walked through the door. And people came. Year after year they came to see the restored vessel of a lost expedition, to read the story of Captain William Harrington, to marvel at the journals and the charts and the engraved instrument recovered from a hidden compartment after 70 years in the dark. But something happened that the historians hadn't quite expected, and that Caleb had never asked for. The people who came to see Harrington's boat learned about Caleb Anderson too. They couldn't help it. The story of the vessel was inseparable from the story of the man who'd found it, the single father, the mechanic, the man everyone overlooked who'd been handed a broken boat as a joke and turned it into a gift to the whole world. The museum told that story on a plaque near the entrance, whether Caleb liked it or not, and it became, in its own quiet way, as much a part of the exhibit as the boat itself. Fathers brought their sons and daughters to see it. Teachers brought their classes. And they'd stand in front of that plaque, and they'd read about a man who was judged all his life by the color of his skin and the size of his bank account, and who was told he didn't belong, and who was trusted in the end with something priceless, and who proved worthy of that trust every single day when it would have been easier and richer not to be. Kids who'd been told they were nothing stood in front of that plaque and understood maybe for the first time that the world's opinion of a person on the outside had nothing to do with what was on the inside. That was the thing Caleb was proudest of in the end. More than the boat, more than the money, more than the house with the yard and the tree. It was the kids standing in front of that plaque, seeing that a man like them had been worth something all along. Because that was the whole truth of it. The truth Caleb Anderson had known his whole life, and the world had taken 36 years to see that the worth was always there. It didn't get created by a discovery, or an offer, or a fortune. It was there in a man who gave away half his sandwich to an old dockhand. It was there in a man who ran into the rain for someone who could do nothing for him. It was there in a father who worked double shifts and hid his exhaustion and sewed a rabbit's ear back on twice. It was there the whole time in the man everyone walked past. All it ever took was for someone to look closer. Sal passed a few years after the opening peaceful in his sleep, an old man who'd worked the docks his whole life and been treated like glass by everyone but one. Caleb spoke at his funeral. He didn't say much, Caleb never did, but what he said people remembered. Sal Patrizio told me once, Caleb said standing before the small gathering, that you can tell everything about a man by how he treats the fella who can't do a thing for him. And I've thought about that every day since, because Sal couldn't do a thing for me, not one thing. He was just an old man on a bench with half a sandwich, and he turned out to be the best friend I ever had. Caleb looked out at the faces. The world's always gonna tell you that the people who matter are the ones who can help you get somewhere. Don't you believe it? The people who matter are the ones you help when there's nothing in it for you. That's where a man's whole worth is. Sal taught me that. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of it." He sat down. And in the back of the room, a young man from the Harrington Trust's third class. A kid who'd been told his whole life he'd never amount to anything. Now a master shipwright with steady hands and a future wiped his eyes and understood all the way down exactly what he'd been given and by whom. Caleb Anderson lived a long life. He never became someone else. That was the thing everyone always remarked on, the thing that made the story last. He got up early. He worked. He raised his daughter to look people in the eye and to always look closer. He and Vivian built something together that was bigger than either of them. Not just a business, though it was that, but a partnership of two people who'd both been handed empty lives full of the wrong things and had figured out together how to fill them with the right ones. Amara grew up and became a woman who was, everyone agreed, exactly like her father, not in her work, which she chose for herself, but in the way she moved through the world. The way she looked at people. The way she never once her whole life judged the worth of a thing or a person by the outside of it. She'd promised her father that once, standing in front of a restored boat when she was 8 years old, and she kept the promise every day of her life. Years and years later, when Caleb was an old man himself, gray, now his hands finally slowed by the same work that had built him, he took his granddaughter to the museum to see the Celeste. She was 6, the same age Amara had been when it all began, and she stood in front of the great restored vessel with her small hand in her grandfather's, weathered one, and she looked up at him with enormous eyes. "Grandpa, did you really find this?" "I pulled up a floorboard, baby," Caleb said, smiling. "That's all I did. The finding was the easy part." "What was the hard part?" Caleb Anderson looked down at his granddaughter, at the newest of the people he'd spend the rest of his name being remembered on, and he told her the truest thing he knew. The thing his whole long life had come down to, the thing he'd learned, broke and kept rich, and would carry with him to the end. "The hard part," he said, "was doing right by it once I had it. Any man can find a treasure, sweetheart. Not every man does right by one." He squeezed her small hand. "You remember that. It's not what you find in this life that measures you. It's what you do with it once you've got it." And the man everyone had overlooked. The single father, the mechanic, the man they said would never rise above his circumstances. The man handed a broken boat as a joke, who turned it into a gift for the whole world. Stood there in the light with his granddaughter's hand in his, in front of the treasure he'd saved. And he knew all the way to his bones that he had done exactly that. He had done right by it. And in the end, that was worth more than $85 million, more than any fortune, more than anything a man could hold in his 2 hands. Because the greatest treasures were never the ones locked away in vaults. They were the ones a man was brave enough to give back to the light. And Caleb Anderson had given back everything he'd found and become in the giving, the richest man that Harbor had ever known.